Hi, my name is Madeline. Welcome to my watercolor wintry cabin tutorial. Today we will be painting this snowy landscape with this small, quaint little cabin at the center of our painting. I will be showing you some tips on learning how to get this snowflakey watercolor effect using salt. We are going to have so much fun today, so let's get started. As we start this tutorial, I want to quickly go over the supplies that I will be using today. I am using 100% cotton watercolor paper. It's 140 pounds. The brand is Arches. I find that I get the best results with these wet on wet washes when I use 100% cotton watercolor paper. And I am going to just be using regular sea salt. I have it kind of in this little palette tray right here, and the brand is just regular McCormick sea salt that I grabbed at Target. And I have my watercolor paper taped down on this board because we are going to be tilting it when we paint our background. So I'm going to grab my 1-inch flat brush and some clean water, and I'm going to start wetting our paper right here. And so I painted this piece about 6 times while I was putting this tutorial together because I wanted to figure out how to consistently get that delicate snowflakey like crystal look with our watercolor paint. And so in all the times that I did this piece, I learned a few tips, and that's what I want to share with you guys today. And so the first tip is that the paper really matters. I tried this with several different types of paper, and I got the best results with Arches cold pressed paper, and that's what I'm currently using. I used a few different brands of 100% cotton watercolor paper, and I got the best results, the most consistent results with Arches. The second tip is that we want to give the paper a little bit of time to absorb the water before we start wet on wet painting. So I'm going to give it about 30 to 45 seconds, and I'm just going to start mixing my paint on the side right here before we get started. And the third tip is that we want our paint to be not too dark so that the watercolor flakes don't show, and not too light. The background is so white that we can't really notice this really cool salt effect. I have 2 different colored blues, and I'm going to tilt my board upright like this and with the blue paint, and I'm going to kind of make these broad brush strokes across the upper half of my paper, and I'm letting gravity pull that paint downwards because it gives this background kind of like a rainy, snowy feel with the gravity pulling that paint down. And I think when we add the salt, we're going to get really pretty textures. And so I want there to be 2 different blues, and I'm leaving some white space in between the blue streaks so that it kind of looks like there's misty, cloudy skies. And then now I'm going to grab my sea salt, and I'm just going to sprinkle some along the upper half of our landscape. And so if you look, you can see that the salt is sitting on paint underneath the salt. And so we want our paper glistening. We don't want to see puddles of water, but we don't want the paper to be dry either. So sometimes if you don't use enough water, or you don't let the water kind of get into the paper enough, then the paper can dry a little bit more quickly, and then you're not going to get that snowflakey salt effect. So I like how much salt I added right here, and so now I'm going to wait and let the salt do its thing. We don't want to use a hot air tool when we're doing this technique. We just want to give the paper, the paint, and the salt time to sort of do this technique. Okay, so it's been half an hour, and if you look, I got really nice big salt crystal blooms, and I really like how this turned out. My paper feels dry, and so I'm going to dust off the salt. And when we go to dust off the salt, you want to make sure that the paper is completely dry, because if there's still a little bit of wet paint underneath the salt, then when you go to brush it off, it's going to smear that paint and then sort of mess up the white snowflake look. So I'm going to go to my trash can and I'm just going to go clean this off. And now with my round one brush, I am going to grab some indigo and I'm going to start painting some trees. So I'm going to start with the right side and we're just going to paint some trees on the right and the left. So I'm going to start right here. Oh, okay, so actually my paper feels dry, but it isn't completely dry because you can see that the paint bloomed right there. So I'm going to take my hot air tool and I'm just going to really dry it one more time to make sure it's completely dry. If you don't have a hot air tool, you can use like a hair dryer, anything that blasts heat will do the job. Or you could just wait a little bit longer. Sometimes I will do the salt and then I'll come back to it like a couple hours later once the page is like completely dry. It's okay to use the hot air tool now because the salt's already dried. Okay, now I'm going to go back to painting my trees. And so I like to paint the trunk of the tree first, and then I take my brush and I sort of just feather out as I go downwards with these sort of like upside down V strokes. And so I'm just sort of giving the tree some branches. And I'm going to leave this quarter part of the bottom of the page white because I'm going to have that be our foreground. So I don't want to paint the trees all the way down. I am going to paint another one. Let's see right here. And painting trees, I have a love-hate relationship with painting trees. Sometimes like they just look really good and sometimes I think I just overthink it and it ends up looking not how I want it to look. And I think what I've learned in my couple years of painting landscapes is that I think we're a lot harder on ourselves than we think. Because a lot of times I'm really unhappy with my trees and then I'll send my picture or my painting to somebody else and they'll be like, it looks fine. And I see a lot of your guys' paintings and sometimes you guys comment that the trees didn't quite look how you wanted them to. But as somebody that's not painting it, a lot of times it does look good or it does look fine. Trees aren't really perfect looking in nature. They're not really that symmetrical and there's big ones, skinny ones, fat ones, there's trees in all different shapes and sizes. And so I try to be a little bit more gentle with myself when I start criticizing like how my trees look. But the technique that I'm using here is I'm just drawing that tree trunk line in the middle and then I'm just kind of painting like wide upside down V's and sort of just pressing my brush sporadically so that you kind of get that illusion of tree branches and leaves. And so I also like to vary the height of my trees so that they're like not all the same height. I like to paint some a little bit taller and some a little bit shorter. And I try to make the bottom part of the tree a little bit darker so that there's a little bit of depth to it so they don't look like super flat. So I want to paint a cabin in the middle of our landscape right here. Okay, so I made the mistake of trying to freehand my cabin without sketching it, and I ended up getting this really like flat looking house. So let's not do that. I'm going to go over really quickly some basic sketching perspective principles. So here is how I roughly sketch a house so that there's a little bit of perspective. I draw a line for the horizon. So let's put that right here. And then I'm going to put down one side of the house right here. And then I'm going to do the other side a little bit further down that horizon line. I'm going to connect it like this. And then I'm going to take the back of the house and it's going to meet the other side of the horizon line. And so there we kind of roughly get a proportionate looking house. It is really difficult for me to do buildings, so this is like as simple as I can make it. It has to do with like vantage points, but I don't fully understand, but this is kind of my elementary way of sketching a house so that it looks a little bit more realistic. So I'm gonna do that sketch really quickly to give my house a little bit more dimension. So now that I have my cabin lines a little bit sketched out, I'm going to grab some black and paint the roof of the cabin first. And so I'm sketching the roof like how I showed you in that little sketch. I'm painting the roof, I mean. And then I'm going to use some dark red for the cabin. So we're going to start with painting the front side, and then I'm going to go and do the back side. And so I'm going to take a little bit of black and I'm going to drop it in this corner of the house that is closest to us right here, because I'm going to make that part seem a little bit darker. And so don't worry about like the actual lines of the cabin, because we're going to outline it with some whitewash later, but I just want that part to be a little bit darker. And so yes, the red and the black are kind of all bleeding together, but as long as the outline of the cabin fits proportionately, we're going to outline it with whitewash later, so we don't need to worry that each side of the house is, painted correctly. I'm going to add a little chimney because I want the cabin to feel like the fireplace is on. And now I am just picking up some blue and some gray, and I'm going to make some lines for the ground around the cabin. And to make snow, like a snowy feel for the ground, I usually just take like a little bit of blue and I mix in like a little bit of Payne's gray or black, so that you get that kind of ashy white snow colored consistency. So I'm just going to darken the bottom of the trees right here because these look a little bit flat to me. And then now I'm going to take my hot air tool and I'm going to completely dry this layer. I'm going to grab a very small synthetic brush to start painting some details. And I'm going to grab my whitewash. And so this is my Etcher synthetic brush. It has a really small, fine tip, and I like it for fine lines. And so I'm just going to outline the cabin so that you can kind of see the sides of the cabin. And again, I'm just sketching out that rough sketch that I showed you guys. And I'm using white to sort of define the lines of the cabin. And I'm going to paint a white door. So I'm going to paint the door right here. And when we're painting the door, we want to remember to match the lines that we used for the house. We want the lines to be like parallel. So I'm going to draw some windows on this side of the house. And now I'm going to grab my liner brush and I'm going to use that same blue that I used earlier to paint some of the ground. And I'm just going to roughly, kind of loosely move this liner brush around the edges of the house and the tree line so that we kind of look like it, so that we're painting kind of like the roads or the ground around the house. And now I'm going to grab some white gouache with the liner brush and I'm just going to add some snow to our trees. So the liner brush has a really long, soft brush head, and so it helps keep me very loose. And I want these trees to have the feeling that like it just snowed. And so the key to doing this is to go fast. Don't think too much about like where exactly the snow should be on the tree, just that there's going to be snow on the trees and maybe a little bit on the ground right here too. And so just kind of quickly dab some white onto the trees so that they look a little bit snow brushed. I like the liner brush for these types of brush strokes because it's not super stiff and rigid, so that our brush strokes end up feeling pretty loose. And then now I'm going to add some snow to the top of the cabin on the roof right here. So I'm just going to add it, and I'm just going to be kind of quick and messy. I'm not going to think too much about it. Just kind of looks like there's snow that fell on the roof and hasn't completely melted away yet. And now I want to paint a little chimney smoke, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some water just right here at the opening of the chimney, and I'm going to kind of go up a little bit. And then I'm going to take some really diluted Payne's Gray and just kind of drop it in on this little water puddle that I made right here so that it looks like there's smoke coming out of the chimney. And so now I'm going to dry this layer completely before we move on. I'm just going to define the edges of the house one more time so that we can kind of see where each side of the house is. I'm going to grab some of the dark red that I used to paint the cabin, and I want to paint a little tiny mailbox right here. And a tip that I have for painting mailboxes is to not make it too big. I always tend to paint it a little bit too big on accident, so go smaller than you think you need to go. And I'm using my small round one synthetic brush again because I can just get really fine lines. And now I am just going to take that same brush with that bluish gray color and make some marks going outwards from the cabin door to kind of show a little road going towards the front of the house. And I'm just going to grab a little bit more white gouache and add a little bit of snow to the top of the chimney and just to the tops of the house, the roof right here. I am going to grab my liner brush that has that long floppy brush tip and get a watery mixture of white gouache again and just do a tiny bit more snow splatters on the top of our sky right here. And then I'm just gonna completely dry everything one last time. And the very last thing I want to do is just to add some loose birds flying into the sky. And we'll just do a few here and a few there. And then once everything is dry, we can slowly peel off our masking tape. And that concludes our snowy, wintry tutorial using salt to make these really fun blooming salt crystals. And I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Feel free to leave any comments or questions for me if you have any. And I hope you enjoyed painting this piece with me.